Welcome to the Win at Home First podcast. I'm your host, Corey Carlson. This podcast is where we talk about how successful business leaders win, not only at work, but also at home. On this podcast, we'll go behind the scenes with great leaders to hear stories of how they win. Thank you for listening, and on to today's episode.
Hello, this is Corey. Today's episode with Kirk Perry is a great one. At the time of the recording, he was still president of brand for Google. Since then, he has accepted a CEO position with a company called IRI, a market research company headquartered out of Chicago. But our conversation is in fact timeless in the standpoint that he shares just insight and wisdom of how he's been intentional with both family, faith, and career, whether it's at P&G and then Google, and obviously he'll continue to do those same things at IRI. We talk about how life is about choices and consequences. So if you make good choices, there's great consequences. Likewise, bad choices, bad consequences, but it's a fun discussion. We talk about the difference between liking and loving your spouse, how he has been a leader with intentionality with his employees and having one-on-one meetings, and what that also looks like in his family. We talk about where you make investments in areas that you want to grow. So are you investing in the right areas? The conversation is fantastic. I hope you enjoyed as much as I did. And on to today's episode. Hello, it's Corey Carlson. You're listening to the Win at Home First podcast. Man, this is going to be a fun episode because I've been learning a lot from Kirk Perry from afar. Had a chance to see him speak at Crossroads at different times, be on a podcast, different episodes that I've listened to over the years. But Kirk Perry is the president of brand at Google. And before that, he spent 23 years at P&G. So just an incredible career, as well as a strong marriage, 4 kids, and a huge man of faith. And so just excited to learn from you today, Kirk. So thank you very much for being on the podcast.
Thanks for inviting me. I'm excited to be here.
What is that key trait that you believe leaders need to have in order to win at home first?
Well, I think for me, it's introspection. And I was just actually sitting with my wife earlier at the kitchen counter reading a study in psychology today about strong marriages. And it was an interesting article. It was a mathematical article. And it was just talking the
sounds intriguing.
Yeah, very intriguing. But it was about a mathematician turned psychologist who looked at the traits of individuals who could, and he presumably said he could predict within 15 minutes how long they'd be married and how successful their marriage would be, based on visual cues, listening to their interactions, and so on. But one of the points he made was that the strongest marriages aren't ones that avoid the small and petty conflicts, but the marriages that allow individuals to quickly take responsibility for their mistakes, own up to them, and move forward, apologize and move forward. In other words, not conflict avoiding, but I think introspection allows you, at least does me, because I say a lot of just dumb things around the house. Honestly, I do. And I just stop and go, is it? And my wife will say things to me like, would you say that at work? And that makes me pause and go, no, I would definitely not say that at work. And I think having a sense of introspection and humility allows you to say, hey, you know what? I shouldn't have said that. I was wrong. And, will you forgive me? And I think that's hard to do because I think conventional wisdom in the world, particularly in business, look at politics today, is you don't apologize, right? Take no prisoners, get the results.
It looks weak, right?
And I think it's hard for people to stop and say, hey, I was wrong. I'm sorry. And I've been fortunate in my career to work for amazing leaders who always said they were sorry, who always took the responsibility for mistakes, who stopped the meeting to say, you know what, you're right, I was wrong. And so I've been fortunate to learn from them. And I think that spills over, interestingly, into my marriage as well, because being able to just admit when I'm wrong, I think is honoring of my wife, but I hope as well it honors my kids, because I want them to be able to see that, you can, as an adult, make mistakes. You can, in a marriage, make mistakes, but you can course correct and continue to strengthen it. So for me, it'd be introspection, in humility and being able to kind of stop and say, hey, I was wrong. I'm sorry. Will you forgive me, and move forward?
Mm-hmm. Great. With introspection, Kirk, do you find yourself taking time to kind of reflect on these last 24 hours, or this how I was, or have you found it, well, it's usually when it's brought up to me and then I have to go think about it?
It's probably, honestly, probably both. I think as I've gotten older and I, understand the dynamic in my family relationship and my work relationships as well, honestly, I think I become more sensitized and understand when I potentially haven't been as empathetic as I should be, or not as good of a listener as I should be, or said something in the heat of the moment that I shouldn't have said. I think my spidey senses are up a little bit more the older I've gotten. I guess you call that wisdom. But on the other hand, sometimes I'm tone deaf too, right? Sometimes I need someone to point out to me the log in my own eye, so that I see it, because sometimes I don't see it or understand it as well as I should. So it's both. I think honestly, it's a little bit of both, probably more than I would care to admit, but it is both.
Our spouses could do a great job of keeping us humble and reminding us of some of the things we do around the house.
They do that. And I think, that's the other thing. I tell my team this all the time. I think, the more senior you get in a company, and I don't care how big or small that company is, the more trappings of hierarchy come into play. Like, where in a lot of ways people expect to serve the leader. And I've learned through my faith, I think more than anything, that leaders are there to serve, not the opposite. And I think, when you're in a relationship with your spouse or with your kids, I think it's sometimes the spillover effect from people always wanting to serve you or always wanting to, to be in your orbit. When you come home, you need somebody to humble you and remind you, like, hey, dude, you're not that important. It's like, in the grand scheme of the kingdom, you are equal to everyone else. And it's important to have that. It really is, because it's easy to get a big head. It's easy sometimes to be sucked into all of the trappings of what, the world says is a big deal. And over the weekend, I was listening to a message at my church here in California, and our pastor was saying that they did a survey. There was some research done. It's a longitudinal study over time. In 1975, like 5% of people claimed that they were important on this survey. It was kind of self-proclaimed importance. And now it's 30% of people claim to be important. And it's just a reflection of our society that everyone thinks they're important. And I think if you look at our divisions, if you look at our greatest issues, they're driven a lot by this sort of self-importance or this idea that you are more important than others. And I think, in my faith, what Jesus has taught us is, if he came to serve, we should serve as well. And I think if more leaders did that, both in the workplace and at home, we could help, I think, more in a lot of ways, more than other factions in the world, bring not only our country, but our world together. I mean, that's a very philosophical point, but I think it is true in some regard.
That's great. You obviously have had a very successful career, very demanding career. We'll get into probably pieces of it, whether it was living internationally or domestically, P&G, Google. But what does that look like over your career, but serving your spouse, serving your kids along the way? Because it's hard when we're at the office. It's hard when we have to work late or we're traveling. So how have you found that way to win at home, to serve when you're actually maybe at the office or at work?
So this is going to turn into a confessional for me, Corey. So I feel like there should be like a black box and a little hole. And I guess I am speaking.
We are at Zoom, right? We are in a black box. That's
this
good.
This is the confessional, I guess. So I hate to say it out loud, but early in my marriage and in my journey of fatherhood, because I have 4 kids. My daughters are 28 and 25, and my sons are 20 and 16. So had a lot of years of being a dad now, as well as a husband, 31 years of marriage to my wife, Jackie. And one of the things about my background is I don't have to get into this, but the quick Reader's Digest version is, I grew up, with very modest means and, spent a year of my life on welfare and age-dependent children. And so it drove something inside of me, which said I never want to put my family in this situation. And so what that looked like early in my career, and someone told me my first week on the job at P&G, work hard now, work smart later.
Mm.
So I ran with that. I was the guy who, and my wife worked on Saturdays. So I worked my first 3 years with the company 6 days a week. Like I was there every Saturday. Because I'm like, my wife's working. What else am I going to do? I had no hobbies. I had no kids at the time. I'm like, I'll just work. So I worked hard then, but I never got smart, honestly. And I had my first child in 1993, and we had our second in 1996. We moved internationally. And I used to, and as I recount this, I talk about the fact that, I would leave in the morning when I was in Korea before my girls woke up, and I would get home at night after they went to bed. I was at best a part-time dad, a part-time husband. I was great to my employees because I was always there for them. And in a way, they were my primary focus. But I justified it by saying, I don't want to put my kid, I'm going to work hard, I'm going to succeed, because I don't want to put my kids in the financial situation that my family was in when I was a kid. So it's okay.
Mm-hmm.
When my world caved in when my oldest daughter got cancer, it completely flipped everything I believed and thought upside down, because I realized the present is called that because it's a gift. Like there is no guarantees of tomorrow. As someone said, yesterday's a memory, tomorrow's a dream, today is a present. And that was my wake-up call. That was my epiphany moment where I said, I can't have a work calendar and a home calendar. Mm-hmm. Every tie has to go to my family. I'm not going to put any business dinner ahead of my family. I'm going to be there for my kids' events. I'm going to coach their sports. And the irony was, when I made that decision to put my family first, my career took off. I was the youngest GM at the time at P&G when I got promoted. I got promoted in about 10 and a half years to general manager. And typically it took 15 or 16 years. I then subsequently was the youngest president on, at the time, Bob McDonald's leadership team at P&G when I got promoted to that. And, I'm not the smartest guy in the room. I just worked hard, but I also got a lot more focused. And when I got more focused, because my family was important to me, it drove a lot of relentless prioritization, cutting meetings and making sure that when I needed to travel, I truly needed to travel. It wasn't just a vanity trip to see someone for a few hours and fly back. I made everything that I did more meaningful at work so that I could spend more time at home. And then that led to, every night I was in town, I had dinner with my family. I, for 20 years, coached kids sports year round. And I had a pretty demanding full-time job, but I was, youth football coach and baseball coach and basketball coach, and even sports I didn't know anything about, like soccer when we lived in Korea. Just so I could get on the U.S. Army base. I'm like, sure, I'll be the soccer coach. But, for me, it was really that wake-up call which spurred that investment in my family and my kids today, which, if I've done hopefully one thing right, is prove to them that you can atone, for things that you're not proud of. And I'm not proud of sharing the story because it's not the highlight of my life for sure. But it definitely, if I could help anybody think about their career perspective, and I have this conversation as many times as I can to let people know it's never too late to pivot. And
Mm-hmm.
you'll find amazing ability to make tough choices that the tie goes to your family. And it's made me a much more empathetic leader, because I now understand, especially during the pandemic, when I get young folks in my org all over the world who have small children, they've got to educate them, they're not in school, they've got to balance, caring for parents, all the while working and delivering and all those things. Like I understand way more now, having been an involved dad and husband, in a way I never would have if I wouldn't have had that wake-up call, 22 years ago when my daughter got sick.
Mm-hmm. I love that phrase. Every tie goes to the family. I just put it into that perspective. I have that belief as well, and definitely live it out. But I just love that every tie goes to family.
One quick story on that. I'll give you one example of where the tie went to my family. When my kids were born, the greatest job in my life is one, being a husband, and two, being a dad. And I promised myself I'd never miss a kid's birthday ever. Because I hear these stories about people like, oh, I was on a trip and I got snowed in. I couldn't get back for my kid's birthday, or I had to travel. I had no choice. I was away from my kid's birthday. I'm like, I'll never miss one. And I never did. And I came to Google, and we had these significant meetings called Zeitgeist, where major customers come in. We're at this great resort in Arizona. And it just so happened that Monday, October 19th, which is my son's birthday, happened to fall during this event. And so the event starts on Sunday, and his birthday was on Monday. And we have this tradition on every birthday that we get up in the morning, we play this cheesy happy birthday song, and we make these pancakes in a heart shape. And so I'm like, I'm not going to miss his birthday. So I left, and I didn't tell him I was going to come back. So I left that Sunday night or Sunday afternoon, and I took a 6 a.m. flight out of Arizona back to California. I was in the house by 7:45, making breakfast, doing the cheesy happy birthday song, taking him to school, and then stayed until that night till we had dinner on his birthday. And then when he went up to bed, I hopped on a plane to fly back down to the meeting, and then I was there for Tuesday all day, for the close of the meeting. And I told my boss, I'm like, I know this is unusual, but I have to be there for my son's birthday. Like I hope it doesn't have any implications, but I can't miss it. It's a vow I made to myself and to my wife, and I'm just not going to violate that. And he's like, no, absolutely not. I love that you do that. It's great. And he shared it with his leadership team. He's like, hey, I just want to tell you the story. Kirk did. So sometimes when you think it's going to be detrimental, it actually is beneficial, because you role model and show that you can do both. You can have this balance. Now, I'm blessed to work for a company like Google where, I can hop on a plane and come home and go back. I mean, not everybody has that flexibility. So I do have that flexibility. I acknowledge that. But I also realize that sometimes you don't know until you ask, or you don't know until you decide and do it. Right. So that's the thing I would say about that. Tie goes to the family.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that story. You said you're blessed to work with work for a company like Google, and that's great. My thought would be there's someone that could sit in your exact same position and just say, because I work for a big company like Google, I'm not risking it. I am not going to leave. I've got an incredible job. I'm not going to put this on the line. What if I get fired? What if this happens? What if, the next promotion I don't get because I make too many family sacrifices? So yes, you may work for a great company, but I think people could still put the thought of big company, it's public, can't mess up. Let's go, go, go. How have you just came to a peace to know the tie goes to family, but I'm going to ask these questions. I'm going to get on planes when I need to. I'm going to come home for a dinner meeting or a family dinner and skip a meeting. Like, how is that working out for you? And when did you decide, all right, now's the time?
Yeah. So, I tell my kids this all the time. I told them this since they were born, because it was, it was built into me as a kid. Life is simply choice and consequence. Like, you make choices, good or bad, and there are always consequences, good or bad. And the key thing is being true to your values and principles when you make those choices. And to be clear, I want to make sure everybody listening knows I don't always make the right choices, for sure. This isn't about like a sanctimonious, like, oh, I always make great choices and, all the consequences are good. I mean, I've made dumb choices with, not so great consequences. But when it comes to something like family, I have come to peace with the fact that if I make a choice for my family and it leads to negative consequences on my career, I can sleep well at night knowing that that was a worthwhile choice. Some things that you make a choice about, dumb choices that we all make and mistakes that we make, have negative consequences that could derail your career that aren't worth it, right? And that's then you have to say, gosh, was that really worth it? Was it worth, name your thing? Like, you read it headlines all the time in the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times about people in positions of power making really dumb choices and having things derail them. But I could sleep well knowing. Now, again, to be clear, I've been making these choices, your question around, like, when did I start doing that? Since my daughter got sick. I've, for the most part, stayed very, very true to those principles and convictions. And it doesn't mean that like there's times when I've made a trip and I'm like, man, should I have been home? Should I have, I'll give you one example. This is one of my dumb choices. My wife's grandma was slowly dying. She was in the hospital. This was 2010, so not that long ago. Every year, my friends from college, we get together and go to I went to University of Cincinnati, and my college buddies, for 30 years, we've been going to the conference basketball tournament. And so it was in March, and the season was upon us, and we were planning to go, and my wife's grandma was sick. And I remember she said to me, are you still planning on going to the tournament? And I said, well, yeah, why? She goes, well, my grandma's sick. And I'm like, I know she's sick, honey, but what can I do to help her? I can't do anything to help her. You're her granddaughter. You're here, right? And if I have to come back, I'll come back. I promise you I'll come back. She didn't pass away when I was gone, but I remember leaving and thinking, man, kind of a dude leaves his wife, who clearly was asking him to stay, behind to go meet his buddies at a basketball tournament. That wasn't a good choice. Now, she lived another 2 weeks, but I think, I regret that, because I should have been there for her emotionally. And because her love languages are time and words of affirmation. And so that time piece is the most important thing to her. And so not giving her that time and investing in her when she was, really mourning the loss of someone who was probably the most influential woman in her life, or about to mourn the loss of that, I shouldn't have done that. So that's an example where I didn't make a good choice. And, there wasn't, she didn't leave me. She didn't banish me to a spare bedroom for a month, but I know it hurt her. And the fact that it hurt her probably was, punishment enough for me, because I definitely did not. So, I learned my point is choice and consequence. I made a choice. There was a consequence for it that wasn't great, versus other things that you make a choice for, like for the right reasons. And if you deal with the consequence, at least I do. I know that I've made it for the right reasons. Another example I give you is just, I've been a very vocal witness for my faith. I've made that choice over the last 15 years or so. I'm like, I can't keep it under a lampshade. I can't not share who I am. I mean, we all feel comfortable going into work, talking about our favorite sports teams, or what we did over the weekend, or the vacations we've had. But very few people talk about, the sermon they heard, or the small group they were in, or, about something they witnessed that was amazing. Like, we don't normally share that stuff. So I've been a very vocal and prominent speaker of my faith. And, there was a situation early in my time at Google where I speaking at Crossroads Church, in fact, and it was early. So it had to have been 2014. So I was only there less than 6 months. And I think it was in March of 2014 when I spoke. And so fast forward to May, I get this call. I was 6 months with the company. And part of what I had talked about in that message that weekend was, I said, I was commuting, and it was a month in, and I was exhausted, and I was gone Monday through Friday, and I was flying back to Cincinnati on the weekends and back to California, wherever around the world. And I remember it was a Monday night. I went into the restroom at Google, and there were these 3 strips of paper over one of the urinals. And one of them, they were called the Amusements in the bathroom. And I said in my talk, I said, one of the cool things about Google is that you can have the view, like the most extreme to the left, the most extreme to the right. And there's a place for all of those views, but the company allows you to have those views. And I said, that's a powerful thing, to be able to debate and talk about things that most companies you can't talk about, right? So I set that up that way. But I said that the third bemusement I call it my Abraham moment. I looked at it and it said, family, friends, and religion. These are the 3 demons you must slay in order to be successful in business. And it took my breath away. It's like 10:30 on a Monday night. And I'm looking at this. I had a tough meeting that day with my new boss. And I'm like, is this God telling me, like, hey, you haven't sold your house in Cincinnati, and hey, P&G might take you back, and hey, like all these thoughts are going through my mind. I'm like, wait a minute, I think God is telling me, no, your family, your friends, and your faith or what's important to help you be successful in business. So maybe that's what I'm here for. Maybe that's my purpose. Maybe that's, so I kind of got a burst of energy. And so anyway, I talked about that in my message. So I get this call, and someone in our communications group was calling me, and they were like, "Hey, Kirk, how you doing?" I'm saying, "I'm good." And I'm sitting on top of our office in Chelsea Market in New York City, and this beautiful view on a summer night. And he's like, "Yeah, well, there's this internet going, there's internet video of you going around." I'm like, "Oh, geez, what internet video is that?" I think you're talking at a church, and you're talking about amusements in the bathroom. I'm like, oh yeah, my church in Cincinnati, very online. He's like, "Well, you said something in there, I don't know. I don't know if you want to have that on there." I'm like, "So what do you mean?" He said, "Well, what if a tech writer sees this and sees you talking about the amusements in the bathroom, and the headline will be, Google's a godless place." And I said, what are you asking me to do?" "Well, I don't think it'd be a bad idea if you maybe ask him to pull that down or, edit it out." And I'm like, "No, I'm not, because I put the company in a good light. I talk about the fact that very different views can be expressed, and it's a wonderful thing. So the context is super positive, and anybody can pull anything out of context, but I'm not changing it." I said, "If you're asking me to, I'm going to turn my resignation in, because I can't be expected not to be able to talk about what's important to me and what's critical." It's like, "Oh, no, I'm not saying that." So, because I'm serious, I'll leave. And I remember it was a very catalyzing moment for me, because it's the first time I've ever had to say, hey, if my faith somehow is a stumbling block of this company, this isn't the right company for me. And it galvanized me and made me even more vocal when I believe something because of my faith. And it's just another example of, I think, having principles and values and living up to them, and not being afraid to take the risk when it is the right thing and consistent with your value system. That's how I think about it.
Oh, that's great. The first part of that story I knew because I was there when you spoke at Crossroads. I was there, and I was encouraged, inspired, because at that moment I still had a corporate job. I had not started coaching business, so I was still there, and I was inspired and thinking that through. And so love hearing that part even again. So it's great. The second part of the story where you get the call from the communications department, I did not hear that. So that is very interesting to hear. And it's timely in the standpoint where I work with a lot of CEOs and executives now. And whether it's a public company or a private company, this tension of faith is so interesting right now. Cancel culture and all these different things that are happening is people are becoming timid to, well, I don't know if I want to have God in my vision statement or not. If it's it's a smaller company, then, or it's, I don't know if I want to talk about faith in the office. So it's inspiring to hear you say, hey, I'm at Google. I'm at one of the biggest places in the world, and I'm talking about my faith, because a lot of the leaders I work with, they're getting timid, and which is exactly where we need to be bold and step out in faith. How as you stepped out in your faith, have you seen that positive ripple effect with Google and with the other folks that you mentor, and what does that look like?
Yeah, it's interesting. So, and you go to Crossroads, so you probably heard me talk about this. I was diagnosed with cancer in early 2015, and it ended up becoming more aggressive in the early stages. So I ended up having stage 4 cancer. And I remember talking to my boss at the time, telling him what was going on. And I said, hey, I obviously need to let you and your team know, because I'm going to be getting treatment, surgery, and then treatment. And so there's side effects and other things associated with that. I'm also going to let my org know. And he was like, I don't want him to worry. I don't want him to, be freaked out by the fact that you're sick. And I said, well, that's, it's just how I roll. And I want to be very honest and upfront with people. And so I sent a video out the next day. And at the time I had, I think, 600 or 700 people on my global org. It was still early in my tenure at Google. And so people were still getting to know me. And I did about a 5-minute video explaining the situation, what was going to go on, what surgery and treatment and so on. I said, hey, there's 2 things that I would greatly appreciate. I said, the first thing If you could just deliver the business, that would be a huge help to me because it's the one less thing that I have to worry about. So, man, if you could nail it, that would be much appreciated. So the second thing is, if you wouldn't mind praying for me. I believe in the power of that. I believe in the benefit of that. And if you're so inclined, I would love it if you wouldn't mind praying for me. If that's something that you believe in as well, that would be huge. And I finished up with a quote from Charles Swindoll, who happens to be a pastor, and it was about attitude. And the very last sentence says, life is 10% what happens to you, and 90% how you react to it. And I said, for me, I don't know how this is going to end, but I do know that no matter what, that I've got a family that loves me, I've got a God that loves me, and I've got an organization that I'm proud of. And that's how I ended it. So it was the last thing I did that day. And I try, and I'm going to be honest, I don't always do a good job of this, but when I get home, I try to leave my work phone flipped over in my cubicle so that I don't have to think about work, and not always successfully, I might add. But I came in the next morning to work. I usually get in early when I was in the office, and my assistant's like, oh my gosh, Kirk, I had to set up a folder for you. I dropped all of the responses in the folder. You're not going to believe it. So I sat in my office and I opened this folder she had set up for me. I had 350 responses to my video.
That's like 55%.
Yeah. And but it got more throughout the course of the 50 days. So the stories that people in the organization shared with me, breathtaking, about things they had been through, or their faith journey, or their struggles in life. Some weren't faith-based at all. People just appreciated my honesty and the fact that I was so overt about what I believed and why I believed it. And to this day, 6 years later, I will still have people say, I remember that video you sent, or I remember you're a man of faith because of a video you sent. Maybe they don't remember the context, or I remember hearing a story about a video that you sent. I hear that occasionally. But, I talk about being bold in my faith, and that I think was a bold faith statement, but it opened up a line of connection to my organization that I otherwise wouldn't have had if I wouldn't have done that. I could have easily not told them what was going on. I mean, I could have, a lot of people believe as a leader, you shouldn't be vulnerable. And I think the opposite. I think leaders are humble, authentic, and vulnerable. And I think that's my big three on leadership. And I think I tried to be that. I'm not always that all the time. I, again, admit that. But I think great leaders figure out how to do that the preponderance of their time. And so it opened up communication and lines of communication. And I've had, several people who will reach out to me and say, hey, I just had a young woman in my org who I've known for years. And I do this monthly office hours where I open up my calendar for an entire day from 7:30 to 6:30 at night, 15-minute blocks. Anybody in my org can jump on. And we talk about everything from what they're doing on their job to career advice and everything in between.
Once a month, that you said?
Once a month.
Cool.
One day a month. And it's my favorite day because I get to meet people that I otherwise wouldn't get to spend that much time with, if at all. So it's my energizing day of the month. And I had a young woman in my organization say, hey, I'm really curious. I know, because I've heard you speak and use words like blessed and faith, and the pandemic has really caused me to examine my faith, and I have some questions for you. So we spent our entire 15 minutes, and at the end, she said, this has been so great, but I feel like I just got a nugget. Can we set up more time? I said, absolutely. So we set up another half hour and just had the opportunity to interact with her on questions of faith. And I remember clicking out of the meeting and thinking, gosh, thank you, God, for the opportunity to share who you are with people in a way that I otherwise wouldn't get to, because you've opened these doors that you've led me through and enabled me, because I would have been voted least likely in high school to ever share my faith, because I was always taught that it was something you not hide, but it's very private. You don't share. My dad used to call people who openly shared their faith Bible beaters and Bible thumpers.
Yeah.
So it was never a thing that I would have ever thought about, and I was uncomfortable. And now I get in front of 1,000 people and can easily, in a business setting, I don't tell people all the time, I don't wear a I love Jesus neon sign on my forehead. But what I do is weave in my faith in ways that, God loved the guys who stand in the corner with the megaphones. God loved them.
Mm-hmm.
That's not me. That would not attract me or draw me at all. What does attract me draw me is when people drop hints as to what they are or who they are, and allows me to follow up and investigate more, ask questions, and really get to know them differently. And I think that's the thing I try to do, is plant seeds and drop seeds. So I use words like blessed and, talk about, well, my faith is really important to me.
And fertile soil. That's a good one. Fertile soil, fruit.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's a whole thing about that in the Bible. But it's, again, it's not like, hey, let me tell you, I'm going to convert you. I just don't, I think in God's time, he's the one that brings people's hearts to him, not us. We simply are the tenders of that field, and we pull the weeds and we water and we prune and we help nurture and bring it along. But we don't bring anyone to the Lord. He brings them, and he doesn't need our help. And so I'm just a helper, along the way, in whatever small way I can, to open up the aperture to ask these questions about God and Jesus. So that's what I think my role is.
That's great. Thank you very much for listening to today's episode. I hope you are enjoying it so far. Before we go back to the rest of this episode, I want to share with you my book, Win at Home First. Some of you have read it, so thank you very much. For others of you, you have not. And I encourage, if you're looking for a resource to help you with these times of your work is now in your home and your home is now in your work, and what this looks like, this book is being helpful to many leaders like you. Forbes magazine said it was one of 7 books everyone on your team should read. And the book is broken up into 4 different sections to help you. First is about you, understand who you are. The second is marriage and ideas and tips to help with your marriage. Third is parenting. And then last is work. So these 4 different sections to help you recalibrate during this time and to help move forward. So if you are needing additional resources, I encourage you to check out my book, Win at Home First. It is available on Amazon as well as Audible. And so on to the rest of the episode. Thank you very much. And what about externally facing, with customers or suppliers, or as you're engaging? I mean, there's got to be a positive ripple effect there as well, because I have heard from leaders at times like, well, inward will be, we may talk about faith, but we go outward. Well, they don't say this, but it's the risk of losing revenue. It's the lose, putting profit over purpose. And so how's that looked as you have gone outward?
Yeah, I think, again, for me, it's how do you bring it up in an appropriate way at the appropriate time? Like, if you're in a meeting and you're discussing your deal, your deal structure for the next year, and there's no appropriate time, there's no appropriate time. Like, I think there's a time and place for everything.
Right.
It might be, when you're chatting one-on-one after the meeting, or, the opportunity comes up, because I think that's where I try to plant those seeds. But I'll give you one example. A really close friend of mine in Indianapolis, this guy he's an entrepreneur, but he has such a heart for servitude. And he owned his own firm, a commercial snow removal and landscaping business. He sold his portion of it, and he'd been looking for another opportunity to do something. He had a heart for people who were suffering from addiction. So he started this company called Hope Grows in Indianapolis. And it's got this beautiful visual on all of his trucks and his vehicles, but he has this beautiful visual of hands going like this. Mm-hmm. And the company started, when you click on his website, what he shares is that his company actually takes and employs people who are in addiction recovery programs and puts them to work. Because one of the hardest things to do when someone gets out of prison or someone gets out of an addiction facility is finding full-time employment. And I have family members who've gone through this, and it's really hard to land a job. Mm-hmm. And so he's created this, he bought a company that actually had a property that he's turned into think of it as like a halfway house, where these guys come out of addiction recovery centers, they go into these homes and they work for him. And at some point they graduate and move on, but he gives them that bridge. And so again, the logo, the website, he explains it all. He doesn't say like, hey, this is about Jesus, this is about God, but it's more about this, like, how do you help a fellow human being out and give them an opportunity? Right. Yep. And I think that invites questions, it opens things up, it creates a conversation, and it's an opportunity to talk about it. So I just love that he does that. And I think there's room for, some level of specificity when it's right, but I also think there's room for, how do you seed plant to get people interested that they didn't follow up and then you can have a more in-depth conversation.
Yep. No, that's good. You talk about the day of the month where you do those 15-minute increments and the intentionality you have of, one-on-ones with your team. How does that look like from a family perspective? Do you and Jackie have a rhythm of X amount of date nights per month? And then what about the one-on-ones with your kids? Obviously you have some out of the house and you still have your son in the house, but what's that look like from your intentionality of spending time with them, especially as you travel?
Yeah. So one of the things we've been very blessed with is we've had a spread of ages. So when we had 4 in the house, we always had a built-in babysitter, which was nice because when we moved overseas in 1997, we were, one of the things about being an expat is it's a great, vibrant social scene. And we were living in the US. We didn't really do anything socially because we were too busy with kids and work and, family being close. So that opened up an aperture of social life that we never really had. So we were abroad for 6 years. So we got in this rhythm of spending time together, alone out, with friends out, and it became such a part of the fabric of our lives. Then when we moved back, we, by definition, just built in at least a date night a month, at least one, but subsequently more when we had the opportunity. We always took a trip every year, just she and I, 3 to 5 days, just to get away and remember. We always joke, remember why we loved each other. Then I also wanted to be a role model for my kids. You have to invest in your relationship because it's just not a given that once you get married, it'll just be there forever. Like you have to invest in a relationship like you invest in keeping fit, like you invest in your career, like you invest in the stock market. You have to stay up with it or it's going to get weak and not be as built for the long term. With my kids, my girls were young. For all of them, I did one big trip. So I took the girls to New York and we went to like a Broadway show. We went to Statue of Liberty and all the things that New York has to offer. My 20-year-old, we went to Washington, D.C. because he was a history buff. And this was between the ages of like 7 and 10. And then my youngest guy, he and I went to Hawaii for spring break alone, and deep sea fishing, scuba diving, golfing, just hanging for a week. So, and they all remember those trips vividly. Yeah. But I also had dates with them. I would just go out with them one-on-one or, coaching their sports, but that was more of a group thing, but, investing in them. So all of my kids, one of their love languages is time. They just like spending time. And so we're at the end. We're a little over a year out of being empty nesters. And we've been really trying to prepare ourselves for what that will be because we've been so we'll have 29 and a half years of kids under roof. And it's going to be a shock to the system to all of a sudden just be she and I. Like, what's our rhythm together? Because I think the pandemic has prepared us a little bit for that. We have a saying that we always love each other, but we don't always like each other.
Yes.
And love is a choice, and liking happens. And I think for us, it's making that investment so that we have the emotional capital to weather any storm. We had some challenges with my daughter's cancer, with my cancer, with other things going on in our lives, with extended family that, we are tough and we'll fight through anything, but we want to have an enjoyable, second act and do things together. But it's built upon a foundation of investing in each other along the way. Because I don't think you can just wake up when the kids are gone and go, okay, all right, what are we doing now? I think it's like running a marathon. There's a training schedule and regimen. You have to do long, slow runs, and you've got to do speed work, and you've got to do interval training, and you've got to do weight training and nutritional training. And there's a lot to prepare for a marathon. I think marriage is that way for the entirety of that marriage. And so that's how I've invested, in them individually. And to this day, I still talk to my kids every day. Now, there may be a few days here and there when we don't connect because they're full-time workers or full-time. My 20-year-old plays football at Cincinnati, and that's like a full-time job for him in addition to school. So we talk every day, but there may be a day or two we miss. But it's just important to stay connected because they're the most important things in my life. So I don't want to mess up that investment.
Yeah, no, that's great. Yeah, as Holly and I talk about, the phrase we'll use in our house is being roommates. Like if we could see that drift is happening where we just start to feel like roommates, it's like, all right, let's have the conversation bit, the introspective portion of it, and then going on the dates so it doesn't drift too long. Kirk, what are you hearing from God right now?
Yeah, there's a lot going on. I mean, I'm in an interesting phase of my life. Like I said, it's what I'm hearing from God right now is a focus on what's next, because as I think about, I've got less time in the business world than more. Obviously, I just mentioned my youngest will be graduating and going away next year, so we're empty nesters. We're really like, what I'm asking God to do is help me figure out like what He has for me next, because I've learned the hard way. I'm unfortunately thick-headed, and I don't always hear what God is telling me as overtly as I want to. But I'm really trying to listen and discern God's voice. And I think sometimes that's hard, because I always have to stop and say, all right, is that my ego talking to me? Is that my wishful thinking talking to me? Or is that God talking to me? And, and I have spiritual friends in my life, close friends, who I ask like, hey, I think I'm hearing this from God. What do you think? And they'll ask me some really good questions. And I'm like, oh, one of my friends, when I was, having some conversations recently about what I do next, he's like, well, I've always found that if my head and my heart are in the right place with God, He'll honor whatever decision I make. Because, and he said, I think there are many paths you can take in your life that will honor God. There isn't just one. And, does God encourage you? Like when I came to Google, it was a definite, like, not only was God encouraging me, it was like banging me over the head. I could write a book about the overt, specific instances where God spoke through others, or from a stage, or in a book, or in a movie, whatever, about me coming here to California, almost 8 years ago now. And other things aren't as clear and obvious. And so what is God telling me now? I'm just, back and forth with Him right now on what's next for me. How do I think about my career? How do I think about my relationship with my wife and my kids as we enter this different phase? How do I think about my investment in my future related to how I impact the kingdom? Because that to me is the most important job I have in the back part. I mean, I've lived more of my life than I will live from this point forward. I'm 54. And so the reality is I have less time than more. And so I want to maximize every moment. There's two books I've read recently. One's called Transfluence by Walt Rakovic, which was an amazing book. He was the CEO of Prologix, which was the office, or not office, but they were like, not a commercial real estate company. I guess they were kind of a commercial real estate company, rent facilities, lease facilities. Incredible story about leadership. But he's a faith-based guy. He's part of a group I'm in called the CEO Forum, which is a faith-based leadership group. And he's part of that. And he wrote this book. It was amazing. The other one is a book by Bob Buford, who wrote Halftime. But his second book was about what comes after halftime. Like, what do you do? And I'm looking for it. I can't see it right now in the corner of my eye. And Finishing Well. It's called Finishing Well. And it's right there. I saw it now finally. But it's about like, what do you do in the back half of your life to use the gifts God's given you while using what you've learned in the business world to make an impact? And I think that's the thing that, I'm spending a lot more time talking to God about, wrestling with God about, is what do you want me to do next? And I think, reading things like that has given me some insight about how do I leverage my gifts? How do I take what I'm passionate about, but also what God's calling me to do? The other thing I've learned is, if I want to resist God, God's okay with that. He'll let me resist Him. But then back to my choice and consequence, there is a consequence of resisting God. You won't be as fulfilled, right? You won't maximize your kingdom impact. You won't be able to leverage all the skills that He's blessed you with and learned over the years to help others. And so I think there's choice and consequence there too. And I'm really trying to, one other book I might drop in here. Sorry. Ryan Atkins, I think Ryan, he goes to Crossroads. He is a young man who had a tragic accident where he was paralyzed as a quadriplegic, and he wrote a book called One Step Closer. It's about his faith journey. This kid who was an all-star in college and was going to have an incredible business career in his senior year has a tragic accident and ends up quadriplegic, and just about his journey. And so again, you just read about people like that who are impacting others, even in tragedy. And I think, gosh, how can I impact others in a way that I leverage those things that God has blessed me with? And so that's what I'm talking to God about now, and what I'm trying to listen for really clearly now.
Yeah, that's good. One thing you said in there that it was hard for me to realize but learn is God doesn't need us, but he wants us. So if we want to resist God, I mean, he doesn't need us to, expand the kingdom. He's doing it already. He's at work. But do we want to participate? That's a whole nother story. And are we going to raise our hand and step up? And I need to check out Transfluence. Yes, Ryan Atkins' book, man, that is an amazing book and super inspiring, and just what he's gone through, and how he can still keep his eyes, his face set on God. So it's pretty cool.
Yeah, it is.
Kirk, what's the best way for people to get a hold of you?
Best way is probably LinkedIn.
LinkedIn?
Short of giving my Google email address out, but LinkedIn.
Just do LinkedIn. That's great. You never know. So, well, thank you so much for being on here, and I could keep talking, but love to just continue the conversation, and just thank you for the time and investing in the Win Home First audience, and sharing your faith and being a bold leader out there for us just to learn and get inspired from. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much for having me on. It was my honor.
I want to thank you for listening to my podcast, Win at Home First. I am so grateful to hear from listeners like you that this content has been helpful. So now I would love for you to pay it forward. I want to get this message in the hands of more listeners. We need leaders to be winning both at home and at work, especially during this time. So please take a minute to share this episode with somebody you think would find value in it, as well as rate and subscribe. As a thank you, please visit my website at corymcarlson.com to download a free resource that people are finding value in. Thank you very much.
This is thepodcastfactory.com.